Welcome to Conversations, Season 2 of the MTA podcast series, a weekly audiocast featuring interviews with leading investment strategists, geopolitical experts, and other key thought leaders, brought to you by the Market Technicians Association.
Welcome to Conversations, the official MTA podcast. I'm Alex Spiroglou, and today I'm joined by my good friend, Ed Carlson. Ed is an independent trader, consultant, and chartered market technician based in Seattle, Washington. He's also the author of the book, George Lindsey and the Art of Technical Analysis. He's also a frequent contributor to SFO magazine, managing the website SeattleTechnicalAdvisors.com, where he publishes daily and weekly commentary. Ed has spent 20 years as a stockbroker and holds an MBA from Wichita State University. Today's topic will be about Ed's book, which I found to be very fascinating, as it is focused on a highly specialized topic of technical analysis. Hi Ed, welcome to the show.
Hi Alex, thank you. Thank you very much.
I must admit I feel a bit funny to welcome you to the show, given that you've been hosting it for such a long time, and I do miss your podcast.
Oh, that's very kind of you. I appreciate that too. I had to slow down considerably on the podcast as the deadline on my book approached, and but still managed to do a couple, and I hope to pick up the pace a little bit as we get it later into the year. But thank you. That's kind of you.
Brilliant. I hope we'll have you back with us again soon.
Wonderful.
So before we actually start the conversation on your book and specifics of your book, the content of your book, what I would like to get is some information about you, information about the author. So my first question would be, could you please give me some information about your personal and educational background before getting involved with technical analysis?
Right. Well, believe it or not, and this may shock some people, I actually started out in life as a guitarist. I studied with jazz guitar legend Jerry Hahn at Wichita State University, and from there I spent a year at the Musicians Institute in Hollywood, California, trying to hone my skills. And at that time, there was a big contact service in Hollywood. I don't know what's happened since. This was 1982, 1983. But I got hired by a Canadian rock band, and I ended up touring for several months with them in the Pacific Northwest before leaving to start my own band. And I spent a couple of years traveling around this area before deciding that the lifestyle, while very attractive to a young man in his 20s, probably wasn't what I wanted to be doing once I reached the age of 40 and certainly not 50. So made a big life decision, returned to school, earned my master's degree in business. While I was doing that, I spent a year on an internship in China, and that was a fascinating time in my life. But I returned just in time for the recession in 1990, but I managed to get hired as a stockbroker by Dean Witter Reynolds, and spent the next 20 years doing that before leaving to pursue technical analysis full time.
Brilliant. And so that brings me to my next question. How did you first get involved with technical analysis?
Well, as a broker, I would see these kinds of reports quite often. I mean, of course, far more fundamental research comes across a broker's desk than technical, but there was a technical analysis, and I was always interested in it and would try and read it. It was always a bit like reading a foreign language, however, without the training needed. But once we got past that 2000, 2001, 2002 time period, I realized I was going to need something more than the approach I'd taken and that the brokerage firms had encouraged for so many years during a major bull market. And so I had heard of the CMT. I knew what it was. Didn't know if I necessarily wanted to, go full time in that direction, but I figured maybe a good idea would be to just start reading the books on their suggested reading list, the MTA's suggested reading list. And so I did that. I read through the entire book selection for all three tests, and I decided at that point, well, shoot, I read the books, maybe I should take the test. And it just kind of snowballed from there.
I understand. So I'm sure it must have been a very interesting journey. So let's switch over from Ed to your work and your book. Who was George Lindsey, and what was it in his background that contributed to his unique methods of timing the markets?
You know, I think that's a great question. I thought this information was important enough that I did something very unusual in a technical analysis book. I included a biography. When you look at Lindsay's family history, you see two distinct strains, I guess, of interest, one from his father's side, which was very analytical, and one from his mother's side, which is very artistic. We know that Lindsay was at least the fourth generation of Lindsays born in Virginia. There is a drawing, an engineering drawing, that still remains from his great-grandfather James of an train engine turntable, if that makes sense. You can imagine, back in the early 19th century. That's about all we know of him, so we assume that he had some sort of engineering background. But his grandfather, this is where the story gets interesting, his grandfather, Albert Loftus Lindsay, Two weeks after the attack on Fort Sumter in 1861, he enlisted in the Confederate Army and was commissioned as a second lieutenant, although he finished the war as a major. But he became the chief of the Signal Corps for General John Bankhead Magruder. And I really think it's this interest in secret codes and messages of his that showed up, 50, 60 years later, 70 years later, in George's interest in technical analysis. But what makes Lindsay different from almost every analyst, that's not true, but what makes him unique, I think, is his mother's influence. His mother was Nellie Victoria Meyer. She was the daughter of a Prussian immigrant and tobacco dealer in Kentucky, and she was a stage actress. She was actually in musical comedies on Broadway and off Broadway. Her picture shows up. It's amazing. I found a photo of her in the University of Louisville, I believe, archives, and also in the University of Washington archives. So while she wasn't a big star, she was a fairly well-known actress. She went by the name of Nellie Victoria. And I feel like she most definitely influenced Lindsay's artistic side. Got it.
So according to the research you have done, what do you think was Lindsay's life prior to his becoming interested in the markets, and when was that?
Yeah. Well, okay, he was born in 1906, and by the age of 21, he had enrolled at the Art Students League of New York. This is not a formal college by any stretch of the imagination, but they boast a very impressive list of alumni. Jackson Pollock, Georgia O'Keeffe, Roy Lichtenstein, they all attended this school. And Lindsay, he wasn't there long, but he was accepted, and he spent some time there. There's something out there about Lindsay being a sign painter. I found no evidence of that. He, after he left the Art Students League, he ended up working with James Yates, who later went on to become the artistic director of the Saturday Evening Post. Is that right? I think that's right. But Yates was a real powerhouse at that time in the 1920s and 30s in advertising. And as a matter of fact, for those who remember the old Camel cigarette package with the camel on the front and the pyramids behind, George actually drew those pyramids. As a matter of fact, a joke in the family was that he got bored drawing the parallel lines on the pyramids, and he had his brother Frank finish the job for him.
I just amazed how you ever found this tidbit of information.
I was very fortunate. It took several phone calls, but I finally tracked down his family in California.
Really?
And not only that, but he has a nephew, James, or Jim Lindsay, who not only has kept a lot of this history alive, but actually is kind of the whole family history thing is a real hobby for him. He enjoys this sort of thing. So I got really lucky. Anyway, by the early 30s, Lindsay was working as a commercial artist for Macy's. And then an interesting tidbit here, which I'm very disappointed I couldn't find more information on. He bought a seat on the Chicago Board of Trade in 1939. We don't know what he was doing, then, what he was thinking. We don't know how much of his methods he had already put together by then, but I also think it's interesting that he sold that seat a year later, actually 2 days before the Germans invaded Paris. And that's so fascinating because trading came to a virtual standstill after that. There were government price limits on grains, and price collapsed. And I think it was his unique knowledge of history that enabled him to see that coming and to get the heck out. And that shows up in something we might talk about a little later, a book he wrote called The Other History. But anyway, just to finish real quickly, he was unemployed at that point. Obviously, his mother, his widowed mother, was still in New York, but his brother Frank had already left for California. He invited the two of them to come out. They said, sure. George says that he spent some time at USC, University of Southern California, studying engineering. Frankly, find no record of that. But if he was there, it probably wasn't for very long, because he then spent the rest of the war at Douglas Aircraft. But of course, once the war was over, they laid off about 100,000 people, and somebody, an artist with very little engineering background, didn't stand a chance of keeping a job at that time. And that looks like the last formal job George had. And from then on, he was on his own, pretty much.
Got it. Okay, so I'll just pick up on what you mentioned about the other history. And my next question will be, the book you wrote, George Lindsey and the Art of Technical Analysis, was possible because Lindsey never wrote a book about his methods, nor has anyone else, at least not to my knowledge. However, Lindsey did write a book, which you mentioned previously, the Other History. Can you give us a bit of information about that before we proceed examining your book?
Well, sure. George published that book in 1969, and he self-published it with what I call a pay-to-play publisher. So, and if anybody read it, you can see why it probably wasn't meant to be a big seller. I don't know that he ever thought it would be, because unfortunately, this is probably the best example of Lindsay's, for lack of a better word, dense style of writing. It's so hard to read some of this stuff, as was his newsletters, from which I reconstructed the models that he had come up with. Anyway, he published the book in 1969, and what he had done was taken this concept of intervals that he used in the markets, not cycles, but intervals of time, and he felt he had discovered intervals of time in history with which one could forecast big changes. He said these things started with an agitation, which might be a heightened consciousness and increased activity among a large number of people at a specific moment of time. It could be physical in nature, if so, it usually involved bloodshed, or it could be intellectual or emotional. A couple examples I'll just give real quickly, and then we won't spend too much time here. But, for example, he had one type of agitation called a creative concentration, and that was a date that would be surrounded by a concentration of great works of art. And he gave a couple examples that I thought were interesting. He had dated the Enlightenment, for example, to 1749. Well, his most important interval was 40 years later. And if you look 40 years later, after 1749, you find the French in the French Revolution. So it goes from good to bad. Another example is in 1905, there was a concentration of science by a host of German writers, including Albert Einstein. And 40 years later, Germany lost World War II. And the whole book is just full of examples like this. And, I really think that if that's all a person sees when they read this book, they probably will think of George as an eccentric. But I really think he was going past that. What George was doing with this book was actually challenging the accepted notions of cause and effect. That's a real philosophical approach that I think put him, whether he was aware of it or not, I think put him squarely into the camp of the early 20th century existentialist philosophers. He was going after something real big with this book, and it's unfortunate he never got his second book finished.
Sounds really, really fascinating. Okay, so let's switch to George Lindsay's methods, the market methods now. Can you give us a bit of a broad overview of Lindsay's methods, and how would you describe his approach to the markets?
I guess in a nutshell, what he would do is, using his long-term intervals, these amounted to 15 years and 12 years, he would look for a broad period of time in which to expect a top or a bottom. For example, his 15-year interval would look for some kind of top, and it could be as short as 15 years from its origin or as long as 15 years and 11 months. Or looking for a bottom, he would use a 12-year interval, which usually was somewhere between 12 years 2 months and 12 years 8 months. And then what he would do within that time frame, he would then narrow it down using his basic movements or standard time spans, which were measured in days. And I think that was probably the heart of his approach. And then finally, what made Lindsay so well known and received so many accolades from so many different people was that he could then take those time targets, those zones, and take them down oftentimes to the exact day of a market top or bottom, usually within 2 or 3 days. It was uncanny the way he did that, and he would do that with using models like his 3 peaks in a domed house, the Lindsay timing model, which included the 107-day counts and low, high intervals, the counts from the middle section. Most technicians like to say that the markets exhibit different patterns, and I think Lindsay would have agreed with that, but he would have said that these patterns are ongoing. It's not a matter of finding the occasional head and shoulders or triangle. I think, at the risk of putting words in Lindsay's mouth, I think he would have said the market exhibits a sense of purpose. Actually, I think he did say that, come to think of it, or even a predestination, and we simply have to figure out where the market is in its journey and then hop aboard for the ride, or at times hop off.
Okay, so given that you've given a description of his methods, and I know quite a few people who have already mentioned his methods, how do you feel your book brings to light anything which might be new, even for those few people who have already acquainted themselves with Lindsay's methods?
Right. A couple of things that made it into the book. Probably the most interesting to technicians will be the tri-day method. I tracked down. Okay, let me back up. Lindsay, it's not well known, hardly known to anybody. He had a partner, a business partner by the name of Stuart Tisch. Tisch had been a practicing podiatrist when he discovered technical analysis, and it became his passion. He gave up his practice for this, and in the end, his family was involved in the Lindsay organization. His wife, Janice, helped out. His mother was the bookkeeper. His father ran errands, and he ended up having a 17-year association with Lindsay. Well, after Lindsay retired, he and Janice moved to Scottsdale, Arizona. And he passed away in, I don't remember what year, but I was able to track down Janice. So I finally found her down in Scottsdale, and she was kind enough to share a big stack of research that she had saved, and in that stack was a method Lindsay called the tri-day method, which I have heard of from nowhere else. This was absolutely new to me. I shared it with a few people before the book came out. They had never heard of it. It was fascinating, and it's, as far as we know, it's the only method Lindsay had for actually forecasting a price. All of his methods are usually forecasting using time, and in this method, you need, once you have a completed 3 peaks in a domed house formation, you then need only the price of 3 of those days, and you can then forecast the bottom for the upcoming bear market, and that's it works so well. It's just so fascinating. The other thing is just what I call the lost manuscripts. It was known by a lot of people that I talked to that he was working on a book at the time of his death. It was supposed to be a follow-up to the other history. It took some digging by James Lindsay, his nephew, and his sister, but they actually found the manuscripts in an old trunk in the garage and sent those to me. it was a long way from a finished book, but I tried to include some of that information in my book. And for those that are truly interested in Lindsay, there's enough there that I think they'll find that of interest.
Most certainly. However, I don't think this interview would be complete without discussing a bit or elaborating a bit on his best-known model, the 3 Peaks and a Doomed House. Can you please talk to us about that model?
Sure. The 3 Peaks and a Domed House, well, it's hard to do, of course, in an audio format, but you have 3 peaks in the market, followed by what's called a separating decline, and this is probably the most important part of the model, and I guess this is the one thing I'd want to get out there during this interview. The separating decline is a decline that comes after peak number 3 that must fall to a low below one or both of the 2 previous retracements, that is, the retracement from peak 1 and or the retracement from peak 2. It's got to fall below those. It separates the 3 peaks from the upcoming domed house. And if you don't get that separating decline that falls that low, chances are very good you're not looking at a 3 peaks and domed house formation, no matter how closely it may look. One other thing I might add before we move on about the 3 peaks is, a lot of people looked at the markets last year and decided they saw a 3 peaks domed house and were predicting an early April top for the bull market. The reason that didn't work is because Lindsays Methods were never meant to be used in isolation. They were always to be integrated together, and that's where the magic comes about with Lindsay, when you put all these methods together. And so using the 3 peaks in isolation may work from time to time. It does, but it's only because in those instances it's still matching up with other of his models and methods.
All right, and in that case, can you tell us a bit more about his other methods?
Lindsay's best known for that geometric pattern, the 3 peaks and domed house, but I really believe that the heart and soul of his methods are these basic movements or standard time spans. Lindsay had discovered different intervals of time in the market. This is what he was all about. They weren't always identical, but the time spans tended to cluster together into similar durations in such that he was able to categorize them into subnormal advances and declines, short advances or declines, long advances and declines, and extended advances. And it's just fascinating how for example, something real common is his long advances. They never go on more than 830 days. If you get a new bull market high after day 831, you're going to be looking at an extended advance, which never lasts shorter than 929 days. So you've got another 100 days of bull market ahead of you if you get that new high after day 30. I think that's probably the most important thing he wrote about, and that's the thing I spent the most time on in the book. And I would encourage everybody to take some time to look at that.
Yeah, and I would probably encourage the people to look at that as well. I found your work very insightful because I've had the opportunity to read the book, and it was truly very well written, very well documented. But I don't think it would be fair for us to give all the parts of the book on the interview. So let's switch back to Ed. Let's talk about technical analysis principles. Ed, if you could distill your market knowledge in a few axioms, which one would this be? For example, don't fight the tape.
Don't fight the tape, yeah. Well, there's a lot of things like that we all use, whether we're aware of it or not. But it's funny that you would ask me that, because I just came up with something the other day that I thought was important enough. I even started a new Word document so I could type it up and not lose it or forget it. And believe it or not, the axiom is this: keep your eyes on the rear view mirror. Now, that sounds very unintuitive. Why would anybody want to be looking at the past instead of the future? And the reason for that is because, and I should only speak for myself, excuse me, but I tend to like all of us, I'm always looking for the future. I'm looking for certain dates that I think we'll see market turns or what have you. But then we'll get past that date, and I tend to forget that we had that, and I should now be looking for the results of that. Instead, I'm looking toward the next date of what's coming next. And the best example I can give you is that using the Lindsay work, between July 1st, let me back up. A lot of Lindsay's work pointed toward July 1st as a high for the bull market. Actually, I should say the end to what he called a sideways movement, which is obviously July 1st was not the high of the bull market. May 2nd was, but the end of a sideways movement means now the bear is going to emerge. We all want to get that top of the bull market, but just as important is to avoid or at least profit from a severe downturn. Well, a lot of this stuff pointed to July 1st. Some other things pointed to July 7th. And as we know, the market got up there and never looked back. Fortunately, in my own account, I was able to move to cash then, but I kept thinking something was coming, and I was hesitant to get short and kicking myself all the way down. So, at least for myself, it's important to keep my eyes in the rearview mirror and remember what I decided that, had been looking for that's now past, and look for some sort of confirmation of it.
Okay, so let's give us a bit of a fun fact. What does Ed do to relax outside of market hours when he's not checking his rear view mirror? Do you have any hobbies?
I think I'm probably no different than a lot of the other folks who'll be listening to this in their off time, checking their rear view mirrors. I'm really addicted to this stuff, as I know you are, but I do make myself get out. And I have a little 3-mile walk that I do probably 5 days a week. Also, I like to read philosophy. I've taken an interest in that in the last few years, and I'm not really sure what's up with that, but it fulfills a need for me personally, and that's pretty much it. I'm a pretty simple guy.
Brilliant. Okay, then. So, in that case, I would like to thank you for the opportunity of this interview, and also thank you for the efforts you put into writing this brilliant book.
Oh, thank you.
And I guess that wraps up today's MTA podcast. My guest today was Ed Carlson. For the MTA, I'm Alex Spiroglou. See you next time.